Oops. Good evening to everyone. Clock says it's time for us to get rolling this evening. As always, I apologize for breaking up good conversation. Please forgive me, especially since today is Christmas. It's good to see all of you this evening, and I hope everyone, you and yours, are doing well. Hope everyone had a blessed Christmas also. This evening, we're going to continue looking at Job. We're going to be in Job chapter 3 this evening, which is Job's curse and lament. Okay. And this is a pretty important chapter. It kind of gets the whole ball rolling, really, in Job. And coming out of the prologue, just remember one thing. We won't, flog that dead horse again, but remember, Job has already pretty much vindicated God's faith and God's confidence in him at this point. And we didn't get to Job's friends last week, so we'll introduce them very quickly. His friends hear of his situation. They make an appointment to go and administer sympathy and comfort to him. Their names are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I had a cousin teach this about 15 years ago at the church he went to in Atlanta. He just called them Eli, Bill, and Zoe. So that works. They come from some distance. Eliphaz is a Temanite. Teman is associated with Edom. And if you look, Jeremiah 49:7, it says it associates wisdom with Teman and with Edom. And I thought that was interesting. But they come and they visit with Job. They don't recognize him at first. When they do see him, they cry out, they weep, they tear their garments in a show of sympathy and sorrow, and then they throw dust in the air above their head in a show of solidarity. And in a real show of solidarity, they sit down with Job on the dunghill for 7 days and 7 nights. It's interesting, too, in that culture, the thinking was that if you went to visit someone to, offer sympathy and comfort, you waited for them to say the first word. So when you think about that, they didn't know they were going to sit down for 7 days and 7 nights. They didn't know how long it was going to be. And that's impressive to me, that they would sit down with Job, their friend, and they don't know how long they're going to be sitting there. In verse 13, they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So we're introduced to the friends, and then we come to chapter 3. And we're going to call this Job's self-curse and lament. Different people will slice and dice this up in different ways, but I'm going to pretty much go with 2 because it's easy to remember. Easy for me to remember anyway. In verse 1. Now remember, Job's sitting in silence. We're coming out of the prologue. He's sitting in silence. Okay, and this is what happens right after that. After this, 7 days and 7 nights, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Okay? Maybe that's not what you're expecting him to do, but that's what he does. He curses the day he was born. Now, one thing you're going to see Job do in Job chapter 3, I would say he animates, he annoys, and he anticipates. Okay. What do I mean by that? Well, Job creates a complication in Job chapter 3. Okay. And that's important because every good story has a complication, doesn't it? And Job's going to create that in Job 3:23 to be specific. Job also annoys. Job's he's a provocative guy, to be honest with you. You wouldn't think that from the prologue, but Job is a very provocative guy. He's going to do this several times in the book of Job, and it usually gets results too. And Job anticipates. All I mean by that is he's hopeful. okay? What he wants, most of all, he wants God to appear to him and tell him why he's suffering like he is, okay? And he finally gets that through provocation. But again, verse 323 is probably the most crucial verse in this chapter. Job there is going to set himself in opposition to God, okay? Okay, 323, Job sets himself in opposition to God. Probably the most important verse in this chapter, maybe in this part of the book, okay? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? Okay. Now, what Job is accusing God here of doing is taking his purpose and meaning from him in life. And that's pretty pointed, if you ask me. That phrase, hedged in, is a different Hebrew word. Does it kind of remind you of another verse in Job that we've seen earlier? How about chapter 1, verse 10? Remember Satan? He told God, well, of course Job serves you because you built a protective hedge around him. So it's a different word, but the same idea. But Job is saying he's taken my meaning and purpose from me in life. He's covered me up. He's overshadowed me, is what it means here. Of course, Job doesn't know Satan said that in the prologue either, does he? Which is interesting. And there's Job's provocations in the book of Job. Again, Job is a pretty provocative guy. But he has a reason for everything he does, and it usually works. Okay. So Job chapter 3, we're going to divide it up into 2 units. Some people go 3 units. You know, the curse, and then there's questions and responses in the middle. And then if you go to verse 20 to 26, there's kind of Job ruminates about the mystery of suffering. And that's not a bad approach there. If you ever want to just read something about suffering, Job 3, verses 20 through 26. But we're going to use the 2 because it's easy to remember. And Job's curse can be found in verses 3 through 10, or 1 through 10 if you prefer. And then there's a lament, and that starts in verse 11 and goes to the end of the chapter. And to show you how this works, the structure of both of these is pretty much the same. In the first verse, you have the subject of the curse, subject of the lament given. And then in the last verse, you'll have the reason for the curse, the reason for the lament given, or the basis, the ground of the curse or ground of the lament. So, first verse, subject, last verse, the reason, okay? And of course, there's stuff in between there we'll talk about too. For example, consider the curse. Okay. Verse 3, I'm going to go with verse 3, the first verse of the curse from me. Let the day perish on which I was born. So what does that tell you? What's the subject of the curse? The day he was born, right. Also, I don't have it up here, but it's the night of his conception also. Okay. So, first verse of the unit gives you the subject. And verse 10 is the last verse, okay, because it, the night of my conception, did not hide trouble from my eyes, okay. So what's the reason for the curse right there? It's highlighted. Trouble, turmoil, misery, okay. So, and that's pretty much the way it works. So let's consider the self-curse, okay? Starting at verse 3. Actually, we'll start at verse 1. And here's the structure of the curse, okay? Again, verse 3 gives you the subject. Verse 10 gives you the reason for the curse. And what he's going to do in the middle, of course, he's already said the subject is the day of his birth and the night of his conception, right? That's what he talks about in the body of the curse. Verses 4 and 5, the day of his birth. Verses 6 through 9, the night of his conception. Okay, so we'll go back to verse 1 and start there. After this, Job opened his mouth after the 7 days and nights and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, okay. Now, starting with verse 3, you remember what's different about this? The prologue is narrative, right? We're about to enter the poetic portion of the book, which is most of the book, okay? So verse 3, again, the subject of the curse. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Okay, so there's the subject, the day of his birth, the night of his conception. Now, what he does now in verses 4 and 5, he talks about the day of his birth. He curses the day of his birth, okay? And what he does, we won't read the whole thing, but what he does is he uses incantations and dark imagery to talk about the day of his birth. Let the day perish. Let that day be darkness. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. You see that repetition, let. In Hebrew, it's going to be something like, may this happen, or may this happen, or may this happen. Everybody know what an incantation is, more or less? Well, there's repetition here for sure, and that's part of the literary form that he's using. But incantation is just like a hex or a charm. That's really all he's doing. Okay, he's putting a hex on the day of his birth, basically. And notice the imagery, very dark. Darkness, may God not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Gloom and deep darkness, clouds, blackness of the day. Pretty somber stuff, really. I will go ahead and say here, a lot of people think Job here is referencing the Genesis creation. And what he's doing, where God created, Job wants creation undone. He wants a reversal of creation. It's kind of like, not everybody agrees with this, but if you look at it and compare Genesis 1 and 2 and Job 3, it is interesting what's going on. It does kind of look like Job is saying, well, if I'm going down, I want the whole thing to go down with me, basically. That's what he's saying. And then verses 6 through 9. Job's going to curse the night of his conception. It's pretty logical how it's laid out, really. And again, incantations, dark imagery, okay? That night, the night of his conception, let thick darkness seize him. By the way, I thought this was pretty interesting. I'd never noticed this. But Job seems to reference the night of his conception as the beginning of his life. I thought that was pretty interesting myself. Anyway, I'm interrupting myself, Paul. Yeah. It's contagious, I guess. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. And again, dark imagery. Let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day. Now that's interesting there. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Now we're going to come back in a second and talk about Leviathan, but that's an interesting idea too. And more dark imagery. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light but have none. nor see the eyelids of the morning. Love that phrase. That comes up again, too, in chapter 41 in the divine speeches. The eyelids of the morning. Now let's go back and talk about Leviathan. Who is Leviathan? Sea creature? Okay. Dinosaur? Okay. Dragon? Yeah, dragons, you're spot on right there. Okay. What he's probably referencing here is Phoenician and Canaanite mythology. Okay. Leviathan was thought to be, it's actually a multi-headed sea monster, but it's a mythological creature. Part of Canaanite mythology. It's part of the Baal myth. And the thinking is that Leviathan and yam, you probably heard of yam. I know you've heard of yams. Maybe you've had yams today. But Leviathan and yam were sea creatures. Yam is the sea itself. But they represent forces of chaos, forces of disorder in the cosmos. And what Baal did in the Phoenician myth is he defeated Leviathan and Yam, and he restored order to the cosmos. And actually, it says the same thing about Yahweh in the Old Testament. You go to Proverbs 74:14, Psalm 74:14, Psalm 104:25-26, and Isaiah 27:1. It's going to talk about Yahweh defeating Leviathan. Okay. The idea he's restoring order to the cosmos. And Job is kind of tapping into that idea, that thinking. There are 5 scriptures in the Old Testament that talk about Leviathan. 2 are in Job, 3:8